When I walked into that courtroom, my son's shame was already written in the air. His wife had mocked me for years, treated me like a servant in my own family. But today, I wasn't the invisible mother-in-law who kept quiet. Today, I was the one holding all the power. As my son and his wife sat across from me, I watched their faces fall when they realized I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was the one they should have feared. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. The words lingered in Joanne Whitaker's mind long after they were spoken, sharper than the tang of barbecue smoke that hung over Chelsea's manicured backyard. The late afternoon sun threw golden light across the rows of parked SUVs lining the cul-de-sac, while laughter bubbled from clusters of neighbors balancing paper plates loaded with ribs and coleslaw. From the folding chair where she sat, near enough to be visible, far enough to feel invisible, Joanne caught the moment her daughter-in-law's voice cut through the chatter like a blade. Chelsea, glass of rosé in hand, tilted her head back and laughed theatrically. Well, you know us. Free live-in childcare comes with the Whitaker package deal. Brad gets an engineer's salary, and I get my very own housemaid and nanny rolled into one. A ripple of laughter ran across the crowd. The HOA president, a tall woman with pearl earrings and a clipboard, chuckled into her drink. Someone clapped Brad on the shoulder as though Chelsea's words were a harmless inside joke. Joanne sat frozen, her fingers tightening around her cup of sweet tea until it bent. The plastic cracked faintly in her palm, but no one noticed. They were too busy watching Chelsea, who basked in the spotlight like a stage actress feeding off applause. Brad, her only son, her flesh and blood, shrugged with a sheepish smile. "It's just Chelsea being Chelsea," he said, as if that explained everything. His words sliced deeper than the mockery itself. He didn't meet his mother's eyes. The smells of smoked brisket and sweet corn turned heavy in Joanne's throat. She forced a smile, a brittle thing that didn't reach her eyes, and murmured an excuse about needing to check on something at home. No one stopped her. Chelsea raised her glass in a dismissive wave, as though excusing the help from duty. Joanne walked the narrow flagstone path back to the guest house she'd been tucked into behind their sprawling two-story colonial. The sun was still bright, the grass freshly mowed, the sound of music and laughter carrying across the yard, but all she felt was the heat of humiliation creeping up her neck. She slipped inside the small, tidy space, shut the door, and let silence fall over her like a blanket. For a long time she stood still, her hands pressed flat against the counter. Her chest ached with a mix of rage and grief she didn't dare let out. Crying never solved anything. Neither did yelling. Her phone buzzed. One line lit the screen. Angela Rowe. She did not just say that in front of the HOA president. Joanne exhaled a laugh, short and bitter. Angela had been her ally for decades, sharp-eyed, quick-tongued, unwilling to let the world trample her. Joanne, by contrast, had always believed in endurance, in letting slights roll off like rainwater. But now, something burned beneath the surface, something steadier than anger. She walked into the spare bedroom and opened the drawer of the small oak desk she had dragged with her when she'd moved in. Beneath a stack of neatly folded dish towels lay a folder she had almost forgotten about. The memory of that day came back, unwelcome and vivid. Brad had stood at her kitchen table, the same gentle pleading expression he'd worn as a boy asking for another slice of pie. "It's just a formality, Mom. Chelsea wants everything tidy on paper." He'd slid the document toward her, reassured her that it was only a rental agreement, nothing complicated. "Trust me," he'd said. She had trusted him. She had signed. Joanne pulled the folder free now and set it on the desk. Her reading glasses slid down her nose as she opened it carefully, smoothing the pages flat. Legal language filled the document, neat lines of black ink she knew better than most. She had drafted hundreds of such contracts back in her years as a paralegal. Her eyes scanned clause after clause, the corners of her mouth tightening. It wasn't just a rental agreement. One paragraph stood out like a lit fuse. "The undersigned parties, Joanne Whitaker and Bradley Whitaker, are hereby recognized as co-title holders of the property located at. Joanne sat back, the room humming with the quiet power of revelation. Her pulse slowed, her hands steadied. Chelsea's laughter still rang in her ears, but now it sounded different, hollow. They thought she was old, tired, harmless. They thought she wouldn't read fine print, wouldn't keep records, wouldn't remember. They thought wrong. Joanne folded the papers neatly back into the folder and slid it into her desk drawer with deliberate care. Her lips curved, not into a smile, but into something colder, sharper. She wasn't just a tenant. She wasn't just the help. She was an owner. And the next move was hers. Joanne sat at the desk, the paper's weight still imprinted on her fingertips. The co-ownership clause burned brighter in her mind with every breath she took. She knew exactly who to call. Her phone rested on the desk, screen glowing faintly in the dim lamplight. One tap brought Angela's name forward. "Joe?" Angela's voice crackled through the line, brisk as always. "I need your eyes," Joanne said, no preamble. Her tone carried the kind of gravity Angela hadn't heard in years. "Bring your reading glasses." 20 minutes later, Angela arrived, letting herself in with the familiarity of someone who had walked through Joanne's doors 1,000 times before. The smell of her strong peppermint gum preceded her. She dropped her purse on the couch and held out her hand. "All right, hand me the smoking gun." Joanne slid the document across the desk. Angela perched on the edge of the chair, her glasses slipping down her nose as she scanned. Silence stretched, broken only by the faint hum of cicadas outside the window. Then Angela let out a short, delighted laugh. "Oh, Joe," she said, tapping her manicured nail against the clause, "Chelsea's going to choke when she hears this. Co-title holder. You're not a guest in this house, you're an owner." Joanne's lips tightened. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. Instead, she reached for a yellow legal pad, the kind she'd used back at the law office. Her pen hovered, then pressed down with crisp authority. "What are you doing?" Angela asked. "Starting a record," Joanne said. "Every comment, every unpaid favor, every chore. From now on, I document it all." And she did. The very next morning, when Brad dropped his keys on the counter and asked too casually, "Hey Mom, could you watch the kids this weekend? Chelsea's got a spa retreat, and I might have to work late." Joanne nodded. "Of course," she said evenly. But as soon as his back was turned, she jotted the date, the time, and the request into her ledger. She wrote how many hours she spent folding laundry, driving Emma to soccer practice, preparing snacks for Jake's playdate. Each line carved another notch of evidence into the growing arsenal. The weekend passed in the rhythm she knew too well. Sippy cups, bedtime stories, little socks mismatched in the dryer. She loved her grandchildren fiercely, but the labor wasn't invisible anymore. Each task landed on paper. By Sunday night, when Brad returned with nothing more than a tired thanks, Mom Joanne simply nodded again, flipping her notebook shut before he noticed. But Chelsea noticed other things. By midweek, Joanne scrolled Instagram and froze at the sight of Chelsea's latest reel. The 30-second clip showed a pile of perfectly folded towels with the caption, "Boomer Energy, why fold like you're running a laundromat?" A laugh track played over it. The comment section was already filling with emojis and chuckles. Joanne's stomach tightened. She didn't respond, didn't even screenshot it herself. Angela did that for her within minutes, sending it with the message, "She's digging her own grave." Joanne leaned back in her chair, the glow from her phone screen reflecting in her glasses. Chelsea was making it easy, too easy. But Joanne knew this wouldn't be won in whispers or screenshots alone. This would take strategy. Her gaze drifted back to the folder in her desk, the words co-title holder bold in her memory. She tapped her pen against the yellow pad, then drew a slow line beneath her most recent entry. Angela had once told her that revenge wasn't about raising your voice. It was about knowing exactly where to place the scalpel. Joanne felt the truth of that now. Steady and sharp. The laughter at the barbecue. The dismissive wave. The boomer energy reel. They thought she would sulk quietly, maybe move out, maybe disappear. Instead, she reached for her phone again, this time to dial a different number. The voice that answered was calm, professional, practiced. David Crowley's office. Joanne straightened, her voice level but firm. I'd like to schedule a consultation, property and labor disputes. Her pulse slowed as she ended the call, the weight of the moment settling like a gavel in the room. This wasn't just about pride anymore, it was about proof. And Joanne Whitaker had plenty. David Crowley's office smelled faintly of leather and paper, old law books lined every wall, their spines worn from years of use. Joanne sat across from him at a wide mahogany desk, her folder of documents resting between them like a live wire. The attorney adjusted his glasses, eyes scanning the contract she had handed over. He read carefully, lips pressed thin. Finally he looked up. This isn't just valid, it's airtight. You are legally a co-owner of that property. They cannot evict you, and they cannot sell without your consent. The words landed like cool water on a burn. Joanne sat straighter, her jaw tightening. So I'm not crazy, she murmured. Not even close. He tapped the page with his pen. But this isn't just about ownership. It's about what they've done to you while you lived there. Question is, are you prepared to go public with this? Court filings, hearings, neighbors knowing the details. Joanne's gaze hardened, the memory of laughter at the barbecue still raw in her chest. They went public first. I'm just answering. That was all David needed. He pulled a fresh legal pad from his drawer and began drafting. We'll file a petition to partition the property. That forces either a buyout or a court-ordered sale. And we'll add a claim for unpaid labor, child care, housekeeping, everything you've been providing without compensation. For the first time in weeks, Joanne felt something other than humiliation. She felt momentum. Angela was already waiting when Joanne came home, a box of manila folders in her arms. I raided my attic for old work habits, she said with a grin. We're building your case brick by brick. The two women spread papers across the small dining table. Joanne detailed every errand, every school pickup, every laundry load. Angela typed it all into a spreadsheet, color-coded by date. They gathered text messages where Chelsea wrote things like, "Can you pick up the kids?" or "Fold the laundry before guests arrive." Even video clips surfaced, snippets Angela had saved of Chelsea's mocking reels. Each piece of evidence felt like a brick stacked neatly on Joanne's side of the scale. Days later, as if on cue, Chelsea hosted a birthday party for Emma. Balloons bobbed in the backyard, laughter carried through the trees, and music thumped from rented speakers. Joanne sat in her guest house, uninvited, listening to the noise travel across the lawn. The sounds of her granddaughter's giggles cut sharp and bittersweet. She didn't cry. Instead, she slipped another note into her growing file. Excluded from child's birthday party. Date Saturday, 4 p.m. By Monday morning, a heavy envelope landed on her doorstep, the paper thick and official. Joanne slid it open with steady hands. Her breath caught as her eyes swept the page. Summons, filed by her own son. Brad Whitaker was suing to evict her. The envelope was heavy in Joanne's hands, its seal already broken. The word eviction leapt off the page like an insult screamed across a crowded room. Her son, her only son, had filed to remove her from the house. When she walked into David Crowley's office the next morning, she didn't waste time with pleasantries. She laid the summons flat on his desk, her hand steady though her pulse thundered in her ears. David scanned the document once then twice, before leaning back in his chair with the faintest smile. Brad's attorney is either careless or desperate. He's claiming you're a guest overstaying your welcome. Joanne folded her arms. A guest doesn't hold the deed. Exactly. David reached for the folder she'd been carrying, pulling out the contract with its shining clause. You're not a guest, you're a co-owner. This eviction petition collapses under its own weight. He clipped the documents together with surgical precision. We'll file a response. And we're going further. I'm attaching exhibits of verbal contracts, unpaid care work, everything we've organized. You've been providing childcare and household labor for months. That is value, Joanne. Courts don't ignore value. Joanne nodded, her mouth dry but her eyes sharp. She remembered Chelsea's laughter, her dismissive wave, and it all fueled her silence like kindling to flame. 2 nights later, Chelsea's voice slithered into Joanne's life through a different channel. Instagram. A post with a moody black and white filter appeared on Chelsea's account. Some people never learn to retire gracefully. Liches live longest. The caption dripped venom, and though no names were mentioned, everyone in their community would know exactly who Chelsea meant. Joanne stared at it for only a second before setting her phone down. She didn't need to screenshot it herself. Angela's text arrived within minutes, accompanied by the image saved forever. Got it before she deleted. She's practically testifying against herself. The gossip swelled. Joanne felt it in the sideways glances at the grocery store, the whispers just beyond earshot at church. But she kept her head high, her hands folded neatly in her lap at choir practice, her smile small but deliberate. Let them whisper. Soon everything would be said in court, where whispers turned into records. When the day of the hearing arrived, the courtroom smelled faintly of wood polish and stale coffee. Judge Rena Caldwell presided with sharp eyes and little patience for theatrics. Brad sat at the opposite table, shoulders stiff, avoiding his mother's gaze. Chelsea perched beside him, her smile tight and performative, as though the courtroom were simply another stage. David rose with calm precision. Your Honor, the eviction petition must be denied. My client is not a tenant nor a guest. She is a co-owner of the property. He held up the signed agreement, his voice steady, unhurried. As such, she cannot legally be evicted. Furthermore, she has contributed substantial unpaid labor, documented extensively. The judge skimmed the papers, her brow arching. She turned her gaze toward Brad's counsel. Counselor, did you overlook the co-ownership clause? The opposing attorney sputtered something about misinterpretation, but Judge Caldwell raised a hand. Her voice was firm, cutting through the room like glass. Co-owners cannot be evicted. This motion is rejected. Joanne sat still, her heart hammering, but she didn't move, didn't gloat. She simply folded her hands on the table and breathed slowly, as if she'd been waiting years for someone to say those words out loud. Brad slumped, his face paling. Chelsea's painted lips pressed into a hard line, her nails digging into her phone screen. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. Joanne thought the moment would bring relief, but before she could exhale, David slid a new packet of papers across the table. Discovery documents. At the top, in bold letters, was a fresh filing, petition to sell property, filed by Chelsea's attorney. The discovery packet sat on Joanne's dining table like a bomb waiting to detonate. She flipped through each page slowly, her pulse steady but her breath tight in her chest. Chelsea's attorney had filed to sell the house outright, treating Joanne's existence like a footnote to be erased with a line of ink. David Crowley didn't waste time. Within 48 hours, he filed an emergency injunction, halting all real estate activity tied to the property. The motion was crisp, backed by precedent. A legal lock slammed across the front door. Joanne could almost hear the click of the deadbolt in her mind when David called to confirm. They can't move an inch without the court's approval, he said, his tone calm but edged with satisfaction. Their attempt to cut you out just gave us leverage. We're not just defending, we're countering. What do we file? Joanne asked. A claim for back wages, household labor, child care unpaid contributions, valued at $34,000. We'll itemize it down to the hour. $34,000. The number wasn't abstract. Joanne saw it in every sock she folded, every carpool run she made, every casserole left cooling on their countertop. It was her life, written in numbers. When mediation arrived 2 weeks later, the temperature in the conference room spiked before anyone had even sat down. Chelsea walked in first, her heels clicking like gunfire against the tile. Brad trailed behind, shoulders hunched, avoiding his mother's gaze. Joanne sat at the opposite end, her yellow legal pad open, David beside her. The mediator barely began the session before Chelsea's voice cracked like a whip. $34,000? For folding towels and babysitting? She's delusional. This is extortion, Brad. Tell him. Brad shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasped between his knees. His eyes flicked toward Joanne, pleading. Mom, maybe we don't have to push this so far. Maybe we can all. Joanne cut him off, her voice calm and deliberate. I'm not letting anything go anymore. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights. Brad's jaw trembled as if he wanted to say more but didn't. Chelsea threw her pen down, muttering, "Unbelievable." Before launching into another tirade, the mediator struggled to rein in. Angela, who had accompanied Joanne for support, sat in the back of the room, her eyes glittering like a hawk's. She didn't speak, but later that evening she filed her own strike. A complaint with the HOA board, complete with screenshots of Chelsea's mocking social media posts and her history of disregarding community rules. Let her choke on HOA politics while you handle court, Angela said when she called Joanne afterward. Two fronts are better than one. Chelsea's fury only grew as word of the complaint spread. Neighbors whispered in driveways, HOA members raised eyebrows at meetings. Joanne kept to herself, tending her small flower bed outside the guest house, but she could feel the shift in the air. Then the letter came, Judge Caldwell's signature crisp at the bottom. The court was granting a full hearing open to the public. David read the order aloud in his steady voice. This means everything becomes part of the record. Testimonies, documents, financials. If they wanted this quiet, they've lost that luxury. Joanne's hand brushed over the paper, her throat tightening, though she didn't falter. The barbecue, the laughter, the years of being diminished, it all funneled into this single turning point. For once, silence didn't feel like surrender. It felt like power. Chelsea had tried to evict her, tried to erase her, tried to sell her out of her own home. Now, by order of the court, it would all be dragged into the light. Joanne straightened, her voice quiet but firm. Then let's take them to trial. The words hung in the air like the crack of thunder before a storm. The discovery phase wasn't glamorous. It was relentless. For weeks, Joanne sat at her kitchen table while David tallied every hour she documented: childcare, laundry, grocery runs, doctor visits, cleaning up after two children, and more often than not, two adults. The number climbed fast, line after line filling David's spreadsheet until the total read like a second job, 40 hours a week, unpaid and unacknowledged. When David turned the laptop toward her, the glow cast his face in pale light. This is 6 months of labor. Judges look at value. Joanne, and the value here is undeniable. They called you lazy, but the math says otherwise. Joanne didn't smile. She simply nodded and slid another folder toward him. Then let's add these. Inside were Chelsea's text messages, subpoenaed at David's request. Hundreds of them. Snide remarks like "have her iron the tablecloths," or "Joanne's around, make her do it." And then the crueler ones. "Old bat folded towels wrong again," or "what's the point of retiring if you're just a live-in maid?" David read them silently, his lips tightening into a flat line. This is better than testimony. This is their own words cutting them down. Word of the case leaked through the neighborhood faster than smoke through a screen door. By the time Joanne ventured out to pick up her mail, she could feel the stares. Conversations paused as she passed. The HOA president offered her a polite nod that carried more weight than words, an acknowledgement that the tides were shifting. Joanne kept her head high, but stayed out of the spotlight. No Facebook posts, no whispered retorts at church, no defensive explanations at the grocery store. She let silence be her weapon, and it unsettled Chelsea more than any rant could. Angela, however, was less restrained. One afternoon, she spotted Chelsea in her pearl-white Range Rover outside the community pool, mascara streaking her cheeks as she tried to muffle sobs behind oversized sunglasses. Angela didn't approach, but she didn't look away either. Later that evening, she relayed the sighting over coffee at Joanne's table. "She's cracking," Angela said, tapping her mug against the saucer. "All that glossy confidence gone. She knows the walls are closing in." Joanne stirred her tea slowly, her spoon clinking against porcelain. "Good. Let her feel cornered. She wanted an audience, now she has one. The pressure was working. Brad showed up at Joanne's door one damp Thursday night, his shirt wrinkled, his expression weary. He stood in the doorway, like a man shrinking under his own weight. "Mom," he said, voice low, can we stop this? Chelsea's stressed, the kids are confused. I just don't want this tearing everything apart. Joanne looked at her son, searching his face for the boy who once brought her dandelions from the yard. But all she saw was a man unwilling to stand between right and wrong. Everything was already torn apart, she said softly. You just didn't notice until now. Brad's eyes glistened, but he said nothing more. He turned and walked back into the night, his figure swallowed by the mist. Joanne closed the door, her resolve hardening like steel cooled in water. The next morning, David called. His voice was calm but carried an edge of triumph. I've reviewed Chelsea's financial disclosures, he said. Her tax filings don't match what she claimed in court documents. Numbers are off by thousands. Joanne's grip tightened on the phone. What does that mean? It means, David replied, his words deliberate and sharp, we've got perjury. The gavel cracked against wood, echoing through the hushed courtroom. Judge Rena Caldwell, robed in black and sharp-eyed as a hawk, settled into her seat with an authority that commanded instant silence. The air smelled faintly of polish and stale coffee, the weight of fluorescent lights pressing on everyone's nerves. Joanne sat at the petitioner's table, spine straight, hands folded neatly atop her yellow legal pad. Her pulse thudded in her ears, but her face betrayed nothing. David Crowley leaned beside her, calm as stone, his briefcase open like an arsenal ready for deployment. Across the aisle, Brad shifted uncomfortably, his tie crooked. Chelsea, all pearls and pastel blazer, sat stiff with a tissue already in hand, her lips painted in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. David rose first, his voice smooth, deliberate. Your Honor, this case is not about family quarrels. It is about ownership, labor, and exploitation. My client, Joanne Whitaker, stands before you as a co-owner of the property in question, wrongfully treated as disposable. Judge Caldwell gave a short nod. Proceed. Joanne stood when called, every step to the witness stand steady, deliberate. The wood was cool beneath her palm as she swore the oath. She settled into the chair, back straight, chin slightly lifted. David's questions guided her gently but firmly. Mrs. Whitaker, can you describe your daily responsibilities while residing at the Whitaker property? Joanne opened the notebook on her lap. Her voice carried clearly, no tremor. Childcare 32 hours a week. Laundry 15 loads on average. Grocery runs 3 to 4 trips weekly. Meal prep, school pickups, errand running. I logged it all. 6 months, 40 hours per week. Gasps rippled faintly from the gallery. Someone coughed. Joanne's pen hovered over her notes, steady as she turned to the next entry. And do you have documentation of these contributions? She slid her folder across. Pages of dates, texts, lists, evidence lined up like soldiers. David let the papers speak, reading only a handful aloud. Can you have Joanne iron this before guests arrive? Or Joanne's here, make her watch them so I can run out. Each line was a dagger. Chelsea dabbed theatrically at her eyes with the tissue, whispering to Brad. Finally, when called, she leaned forward, her voice a syrupy whimper. She's twisting everything. It wasn't like that. She wanted to help. Judge Caldwell's gaze sharpened. Mrs. Whitaker, tears won't answer the question. Either rebut the evidence or sit down. Chelsea's eyes widened, the tissue trembling in her hand. The gallery shifted, even the bailiff's mouth twitched. David pressed further. Your Honor, we submit that Mrs. Whitaker's labor was not voluntary nicety, it was systemic exploitation. She was mocked publicly, stripped of dignity, and treated as unpaid staff. Meanwhile, she holds equal ownership of the property. Joanne's heart pounded, but she kept her face still, her gaze on Judge Caldwell. This wasn't about emotion, it was about fact. And then she noticed her audience. At the back of the gallery, the HOA president sat prim and silent, clipboard balanced on her lap. Word had traveled. This wasn't just Joanne's battle anymore, it was neighborhood theater. Chelsea must have noticed too. Her composure cracked, her whispers to Brad turning frantic. Brad hunched deeper in his seat, tugging at his tie, his knee bouncing under the table. He hadn't spoken a word. Judge Caldwell leaned forward at last, her expression unreadable. This court has heard significant testimony today. Ownership documents, labor records, text messages, and claims of mistreatment. She stacked the papers neatly in front of her. But before I issue any ruling, I require a full review of the respondent's financial disclosures. The gavel hit once, sharp as a gunshot. We will resume tomorrow morning at 10. Bring every record. I want numbers. The courtroom buzzed instantly with murmurs, shoes scraping against the floor. Joanne remained seated, hands folded, breathing slow. Across the aisle, Chelsea's face drained of color, while Brad looked as though the ground beneath him had shifted. Tomorrow the mask would be ripped off. The courtroom was quieter the second morning, but the tension had thickened like humidity before a storm. Papers shuffled, shoes scuffed against the floor, but no one spoke above a whisper. Joanne sat at the petitioner's table, hands folded neatly, her yellow pad resting in front of her. Angela was in the gallery, sharp-eyed and unblinking, her lips curved in the faintest smirk. David stood ready, his suit immaculate, his tone calm as steel. Your Honor, today we present the financial disclosures of all parties, alongside corroborating receipts and bank records. He began with Joanne's contributions, modest but consistent. Line by line, he laid out the expenses she had covered: groceries for the children, medical co-pays, sports fees, gas for the family car she often drove. Each number was small on its own, but together they added weight, a steady drumbeat of proof that she was no burden. She paid, David concluded, holding up a stack of receipts, not just with time but with money. And yet she was told she contributed nothing. Joanne didn't move, but a flicker of warmth lit her chest. Then David turned the spotlight. Now Mrs. Chelsea Whitaker's financial disclosures. Chelsea sat straighter, her pearl necklace shifting against her throat. David read from the filings, his tone deliberate. She reported an income of $42,000, but tax records from the same period show an income of $68,000. The gallery stirred, whispers rippling. Judge Caldwell's brow arched. Mrs. Whitaker, she said sharply, why is there a discrepancy of over $25,000? Chelsea's lips parted, a sputter rising. That was accounting confusion. I didn't. Enough. Caldwell cut in, her voice cold. Do not insult this court with half-truths. Numbers do not confuse themselves. Brad shifted beside her, his knee bouncing rapidly. Sweat glistened at his hairline. David pressed on. Additionally, we have evidence that Miss Joanne Whitaker contributed to property upgrades, purchasing appliances, paint, and even covering a contractor's bill without reimbursement. Yet her son and daughter-in-law attempted to erase her co-ownership and claim exclusive rights to any profit from sale. Receipts flashed across the projector: a refrigerator purchase in Joanne's name, a check written to a handyman, a Lowe's invoice for paint. Each slide struck like a hammer. Judge Caldwell leaned forward, her irritation no longer hidden. So let me be clear. Mrs. Whitaker, she glanced at Joanne, covered household expenses, provided unpaid labor, and directly financed property improvements. And yet you, her eyes cut to Chelsea, misreported your income, sought to sell the house without her consent, and labeled her a dependent. Chelsea's face flushed red beneath her makeup. Her tissue crumpled in her hands. Brad finally broke, leaning forward, his voice shaky. Your Honor, if I may. The judge's gavel cracked once. You may not. You will remain silent until spoken to. The sound echoed so sharply the gallery jumped. Brad froze, swallowing hard, his eyes darting to the floor. Angela leaned back in her seat, whispering just loud enough for Joanne to hear. Better than Netflix. Joanne's lips pressed into the faintest curve. She hadn't said a word all morning. She didn't need to. At last Judge Caldwell gathered the stack of disclosures, her face unreadable but her irritation palpable. I have heard enough. I will review these financials tonight. She stood, her robe sweeping as she rose. This court will reconvene tomorrow at 10 a.m. Prepare for ruling. The gavel dropped again, final and sharp, sealing the moment like a coffin lid. Joanne exhaled slowly. Tomorrow the numbers would decide everything. The courtroom was packed the next morning, air thick with anticipation. Even the old ceiling fan above the gallery seemed to pause, its whir drowned out by the hush of neighbors who had come to witness the spectacle. Joanne sat straight-backed at the petitioner's table, hands folded neatly, a calm mask on her face. Angela was behind her, arms crossed, eyes glittering like she was watching the finale of a long-anticipated drama. Judge Caldwell entered briskly, robe sweeping, face set in granite. She settled into her seat and tapped her gavel once. The echo silenced the room. This court has reviewed the ownership documents, financial disclosures, and evidence of unpaid labor. Her gaze swept across the tables, pausing on Brad, then Chelsea. The findings are clear. Chelsea straightened, pearls trembling at her throat. Brad's leg bounced uncontrollably under the table. Caldwell continued, each word sharp as glass. Mrs. Joanne Whitaker is a legal co-owner of the property in question. Neither eviction nor unilateral sale is permissible. The property will be sold or bought out, and she is entitled to 50% of its value. A ripple moved through the gallery, whispers, gasps, a muffled laugh. Chelsea's nails dug into her tissue until it shredded. Brad slumped forward, shoulders caving as though someone had cut the strings holding him up. But Caldwell wasn't finished. Additionally, she said, her tone gaining weight, the court recognizes 6 months of unpaid labor provided by Mrs. Whitaker, child care, housework, and financial contributions. The respondents are hereby ordered to pay her $26,500 in restitution. The figure hit the room like a hammer. Joanne didn't move, though her chest swelled with a quiet satisfaction she kept carefully contained. Chelsea's face went crimson, her mouth opening and closing without sound. And one more matter, Caldwell added, glancing down at her notes. This case has been marred by public humiliation and disparaging remarks. To address this, the court orders that a public apology be entered into the official records of the Homeowners Association. Murmurs flared again. The HOA president, seated in the gallery, tilted her head with sharp interest, pen already poised above her clipboard. Joanne leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but carrying across the room. Your Honor, if I may request, the apology not only be recorded, but read aloud at the next HOA meeting. For the first time, Caldwell's mouth curved into something that almost resembled approval. So ordered. The gavel struck again. Decision final. Chelsea shot to her feet, her chair scraping violently against the floor. She didn't say a word. Her heels clicked like gunfire as she stormed out of the courtroom, head down, jaw clenched, a storm bottled in silence. Brad remained seated, his hands trembling against his knees. He didn't follow her, didn't look at his mother. He just sat there, pale and hollow. Joanne stood, gathering her folders with deliberate care. She paused by Brad's side, leaning just close enough that only he could hear her. Her voice was soft, almost tender, but edged with steel. Now we're even, almost. Brad swallowed, but no words came. His silence was answer enough. As Joanne walked out, the gallery buzzed around her, neighbors whispering, the HOA president scribbling furiously, Angela smirking like she'd just seen her favorite villain defeated on live television. The humiliation Chelsea, once wielded like a weapon, had been stripped from her hands, turned public record, forced into law. Joanne hadn't just defended herself. She had rewritten the narrative. The woman they'd mocked as the help had just become the headline. The community center buzzed with the restless murmur of folding chairs, scraping across linoleum, and neighbors whispering behind their hands. The air smelled faintly of coffee, from a half-empty urn, and the sharp tang of disinfectant. Every seat was filled. This wasn't an ordinary HOA meeting. Joanne sat near the front, arms folded across her chest, posture composed. Her presence was quiet but magnetic, every eye flicking to her, and then away, as though she had become both spectacle and warning. Angela sat at her side, tapping her foot in delight, whispering every few minutes like a commentator at a prize fight. At the head of the room, the HOA president cleared her throat. Before we address tonight's agenda, we have a court-ordered statement to be read into the record. Mr. Brad Whitaker, please step forward. All eyes turned. Brad rose slowly, clutching a sheet of paper in hands that shook. He walked to the podium, like a man on the way to the gallows, his tie askew, his hair damp with nervous sweat. Chelsea sat rigid in the second row, lips sealed, her manicured hands clenched around her purse. Brad unfolded the paper. His voice cracked at first, then steadied with effort. We, Chelsea and I, apologize for the treatment of Joanne Whitaker. Our words and actions diminished her contributions to our family and community. We acknowledge her co-ownership of the property, as ruled by the court, and we regret the disrespect shown publicly and privately. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting anywhere but toward his mother. We commit to rectifying the harm caused. The silence in the room was electric. Joanne didn't move. She only tilted her head slightly, arms still folded, her expression unreadable. Her son's voice, once a comfort, sounded hollow now. The HOA president nodded curtly. Let the record show the apology has been read. Chelsea remained seated, her lips pressed so tight they'd gone pale. She didn't look at Brad. She didn't look at Joanne. She stared forward, every line of her body taut with fury contained by nothing but a courtroom order. Neighbors exchanged glances. A few nodded discreetly toward Joanne, silent acknowledgments of respect. One woman leaned close as she passed Joanne later and murmured, "Good for you." Another man offered a small smile and a nod, the kind of recognition that said, "You stood up, and we saw it." Angela leaned toward Joanne, her breath tickling her ear as she whispered, "That was better than HBO. 10 out of 10, would watch again." For the first time in weeks, Joanne allowed herself the faintest smile. The meeting shifted back to mundane matters. Trash schedules, lawn maintenance, a debate about the length of acceptable holiday lights, but the energy in the room had changed. Joanne no longer felt like a background figure, the ignored widow in the guest house. She was the center of gravity now. When the meeting adjourned, Chelsea stormed out first, heels clacking, purse slung tight against her side. Brad followed a step behind, his shoulders sagging as though the apology had drained what little strength he had left. By the time Joanne reached her car, her phone buzzed. Angela glanced at her screen first, eyes widening. "Oh honey," she didn't waste a second. Joanne lifted her phone, the message glaring back at her. "Chelsea Whitaker has filed for legal separation." The sound of a moving truck rattling down the cul-de-sac carried farther than it should have, its engine growling like a herald of ending. Joanne watched from her window as Chelsea's glossy white Range Rover sat parked at the curb, its trunk yawning open. Movers hauled out suitcases, garment bags, and boxes marked in Chelsea's angular handwriting. Chelsea stood on the porch, arms crossed, her sunglasses hiding her eyes, but not the fury etched in every line of her body. Brad hovered behind her, saying too much with his slumped shoulders, and nothing at all with his mouth. "You didn't protect me." Brad, Chelsea hissed loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "You let her humiliate me, your own mother. And now I'm supposed to stay." "Absolutely not." Her words hung in the humid Asheville air, sharp as pine needles. She stalked down the steps, heels clacking against the wood, and climbed into her car without looking back. The door slammed, the engine roared, and then she was gone, leaving Brad standing alone in the driveway, hands limp at his sides. He looked smaller somehow, his tie loose, his eyes red-rimmed. "Mom," he started, voice breaking. I don't know what to do. Chelsea's gone. The kids are confused. Everything's falling apart." Joanne let him in. He sat at her small kitchen table, the same table where she had logged hours of unpaid labor, where she had stacked receipts and evidence like ammunition. Now Brad sat with his palms flat against the wood, as if bracing himself. "I thought I was keeping peace," he murmured. "I thought if I just didn't make waves, things would work out. But it's all gone, isn't it?" Joanne didn't answer. She stirred sugar into her tea, the spoon clinking steadily, filling the silence he seemed desperate to escape. Her face remained unreadable, her gaze fixed on the swirl of liquid. "Mom," Brad tried again, his voice fraying. "I know I let you down, but can't we just start over?" Joanne set her spoon down gently, the porcelain rattling faintly. She looked at him, really looked, and for a flicker of a second, she saw the boy who once brought her dandelions and drawings. Then she blinked, and he was gone, replaced by a man who had stood silent when his wife mocked her. She didn't say a word. Brad's breath shuddered. He bowed his head, his shoulders caving inward. By the end of the week, gossip spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Chelsea had maxed out the home equity line before filing for separation, draining it dry. Creditors were circling. Brad was left with debt stacked high, no wife, and a house slipping through his fingers. Joanne didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She let the whispers carry the truth while she carried on quietly. David Crowley called soon after, his voice steady as ever. "The property sale is finalized. Your share is ready for deposit." The check arrived in a neat envelope, the numbers crisp and undeniable. Joanne held it in her hands for a long moment, the weight of it pressing against her palm, like the solid proof of everything she had endured, and everything she had won. That night, she sat in her armchair, the check resting on the side table, her tea steaming in front of her. The silence in the guest house felt different now, not like exile, but like transition. A pause before something new. She reached for her phone, her thumb hovering over the screen. Then she pressed a number and lifted it to her ear. When the line picked up, Joanne's voice was calm, certain. "Yes, I'd like to speak with a realtor." The key was cold in Joanne's palm, but it hummed with a weight she hadn't felt in years, not the burden of someone else's house, someone else's rules, but the solidity of freedom. She stood before her new town home, tucked neatly on a quiet street, just a few blocks from Angela's. The red brick facade glowed in the late afternoon sun, flower beds lining the walkway with petunias and marigolds. For the first time since her husband passed, Joanne didn't feel like she was moving into someone else's space. This was hers. When she pushed open the door, the smell of fresh paint and faint sawdust greeted her. Sunlight poured through wide front windows, landing on a modest fireplace, framed with white stone. She set her purse down on the hardwood floor, listening to the hollow echo fade, and then smiled. It wasn't grand, it wasn't sprawling, but every inch of it belonged to her. The next few days were a blur of boxes, soft laughter, and quiet rituals. Joanne unwrapped her dishes, lined her shelves with books, and opened every window to let the crisp mountain air swirl through. She planted herbs in the backyard, basil, thyme, rosemary, breathing in the earthy scent as her hands pressed into soil that no one could take from her. The centerpiece of her effort, though, was the bookshelf. For years she'd stored away her collection, case law volumes, mysteries, cookbooks, because there had never been room. Now she built it piece by piece, sliding each shelf into place until it stood tall against the living room wall. When the last screw tightened, she stepped back, her chest swelling with pride. Angela arrived that Sunday morning, balancing a tray of still warm blueberry muffins and grinning like a conspirator. "Smells like you finally got a home, Joe." They settled at the small kitchen table, mugs of coffee steaming between them. Joanne raised hers, the rich aroma curling up like a promise. To second chapters. Angela clinked her mug against hers, and to making the first one look like a rough draft. They laughed, the kind of laughter that carried the weight of survival, resilience, and something sweeter, victory. Later, when the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across her new living room, Joanne opened one last box. Inside lay her paralegal diploma, the paper slightly yellowed at the edges, but still proud in its frame. She wiped the glass with a cloth and hung it above her desk, just where she could see it each morning. Her husband had once told her, "Your mind is your strongest weapon, Joe. Never forget it." As she looked at the diploma, she thought of how right he'd been. For the first time in months, her chest didn't ache with humiliation or betrayal. It filled with peace. The silence of the house wasn't exile anymore. It was sanctuary. But peace is rarely left untouched. That evening, when Joanne returned from taking out the recycling, she noticed a large manila envelope on her doormat. Her name was written in heavy black ink, the return address stamped with the Buncombe County Courthouse. Her hands stilled on the brass doorknob. The cool evening air pressed around her, thick and unmoving. She crouched, picked up the envelope and slid it open with her thumb. Inside, the first line leapt out in bold type: petition for spousal fraud. Plaintiff Chelsea Whitaker. Defendant Bradley Whitaker. Joanne exhaled, slow and steady. Her son's unraveling wasn't finished. It was only beginning. She closed the door behind her, the envelope heavy in her grip, the warmth of her new home suddenly shadowed by the storm gathering outside. The divorce filings turned into a public slugfest almost overnight. Chelsea accused Brad of hiding assets, claiming he had siphoned money into secret accounts. Brad in return accused her of draining their joint account and maxing out the home equity line. Their dirty laundry spilled into court records, neighbor gossip, and late-night text chains across the subdivision. Joanne heard about it first from Angela, who leaned over the fence one morning while watering her roses. "You should have seen Chelsea in court yesterday," she said with relish, crying about fraud while the judge read off her boutique charges. A $5,000 handbag. Please. Joanne just kept clipping her magnolia blooms, the scent of their creamy petals filling the air. "They're devouring each other now," she murmured. By the end of the week, Brad's name lit up on her phone. The number flashed again and again as she sat in her sunroom, the evening light slanting through wide windows, her tea cooling beside her. She let it ring until it dropped to voicemail. "Mom." His voice came, strained and breaking. "Please. She's trying to ruin me. I've lost everything. I need you." Joanne listened once, then deleted it. The silence afterward felt like closure. Minutes later, Angela texted a meme. Dominoes falling, each block labeled, "Mockery, eviction, fraud, collapse." The caption read, "Mess around and find out." Joanne laughed softly, the sound surprising even herself. But rather than bask in vengeance, she picked up her checkbook. The next morning, she wrote out a $1,000 donation to the local women's shelter, the place she had driven past so many times on her errands, where porch lights glowed for women with nowhere else to go. On the memo line she wrote, "For dignity restored." When Angela heard, she whistled, "Classy Joe. While they claw each other apart, you're lifting other women up. That's not revenge. That's rewriting the rules." A few days later, David called. His voice was steady, with a hint of warmth she hadn't heard before. "Joanne, I've reviewed the last filings. Everything you needed has been proven, secured, and recorded. You've got nothing left to prove." Joanne sat at her desk, looking at her framed paralegal diploma on the wall. Sunlight streamed through the window, catching on the glass. "Nothing left to prove," she repeated softly, letting the words settle like stones on water. She thought of the barbecue where Chelsea had mocked her, of Brad sitting silent beside her. She thought of every folded towel, every errand, every bruise of disrespect. And then she thought of her townhouse, her fireplace, her garden. She had crossed the bridge from humiliation to vindication, and now she could choose what came next. That night, she poured a glass of wine and sat on her back porch. The evening was thick with summer sounds, cicadas buzzing, the rustle of leaves, the faint hum of traffic in the distance. Her neighbors had begun to wave to her more now, some even stopping to chat. Respect had replaced pity. Acknowledgement had replaced whispers. Across town, Brad and Chelsea were drowning, two people who had once conspired against her now locked in a vicious dance of blame and betrayal. They no longer had her to scapegoat, so they tore into each other instead. Joanne didn't feel tempted to intervene. She didn't want to watch. For the first time, their downfall no longer concerned her. It wasn't her fight anymore. That was the twist neither of them saw coming. She was finished with them. She raised her glass, the ruby wine catching the porch light, and whispered to the night air, "I'm closing this book." Angela arrived the next morning with muffins and gossip, but Joanne only smiled, shaking her head. "You keep the scorecard, Angie. I'm done counting." Angela blinked. "Done? After everything they put you through?" Joanne's eyes were steady, her smile quiet but firm. "Revenge got me here, but peace will carry me forward." The words felt final, solid, like a lock clicking shut. That evening, as the last light drained from the sky, Joanne sat in her armchair, legs tucked beneath her, and let her mind rest, not on Brad or Chelsea, but on herself. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she had to prepare for the next insult, the next attack. She had built walls that no one could breach, not even family. Her phone buzzed once on the table, a new voicemail from Brad. She didn't reach for it. Instead, she leaned back, closing her eyes, the faint scent of her herb garden drifting through the open window. A smile curved her lips. "I've got nothing left to prove," she whispered, "but I've got plenty to enjoy." And with that, Joanne Whitaker, once dismissed as the help, closed her chapter on her own terms, leaving her enemies to collapse without her lifting a finger. The letter came folded neatly in a pale blue envelope, tucked among bills and grocery flyers. Joanne almost missed it, but the handwriting caught her eye, delicate, deliberate. She opened it slowly at her kitchen table, the late morning sun streaming across the page. "Mrs. Whitaker," it began, "I don't know you personally, but I sat in the back row of your hearing. I saw the way you stood your ground. I've been letting my daughter and her husband treat me like a nuisance. Watching you fight gave me courage. Thank you." Joanne's chest tightened as she read it twice. Then a third time, she laid the letter flat on the table, her fingers resting gently on the paper. For years she had been invisible, but here was proof. Someone had seen her, and taken strength from her. 2 weeks later, an invitation arrived. The county senior center was hosting a panel on elder rights, and they wanted her to speak. Angela was thrilled the moment Joanne told her. "Of course you'll do it," Angela said, setting down her coffee cup with a decisive thud. "You have the story, Joe. People need to hear it. Let them know we're not invisible." "I'm not a speaker," Joanne murmured, brushing her hand over her lap. Angela smirked. "You didn't think you were a litigator either, but you tore Chelsea apart with one notebook and a straight face. I'll help you. We'll practice until you sound like you've been giving speeches your whole life." They spent evenings in Joanne's living room, Angela pacing with a stopwatch, Joanne sitting with index cards. "Don't read it like a deposition," Angela coached. "Tell it like you're telling me, calm, clear, and sharp enough to cut." On the night of the panel, the senior center's multipurpose room was filled with folding chairs and the faint smell of lemon cleaner. A crowd of 50 gathered, some leaning on canes, others clutching notebooks. Joanne walked to the podium, her steps steady, her heart drumming quietly beneath her ribs. She didn't read the cards. She set them down. "I was told I was a burden," she began, her voice calm but resonant. "I was made to feel small in my own family, but I remembered something I'd forgotten. I had rights. I had value. And when I stopped being silent, everything changed." She spoke of boundaries, of respect, of how dignity is not given, it is reclaimed. She described the laughter at the barbecue, the documents she unearthed, the long hours of unpaid labor written down line by line. Her voice never wavered. But when she spoke of the moment Judge Caldwell ruled in her favor, it carried a quiet force that made the room lean forward. When she finished, the silence broke into applause, soft at first, then swelling until it filled the hall. Some people wiped at their eyes. Others stood, nodding firmly, as though to say, "We see you now." Angela, beaming, squeezed Joanne's hand as she stepped down. "Told you," she whispered. Later that night, Joanne returned home to find a small envelope slid beneath her door. Inside was a handwritten note. Short and spare, Mrs. Whitaker. I heard about your talk tonight. Well done. Judge Caldwell. Joanne folded the note carefully, sliding it into the same drawer as her diploma, her armor, piece by piece. As she closed the drawer, her eyes caught something tucked behind an old photo frame. She pulled it free. A photograph of Brad as a baby, no more than a year old, reaching for her face with a gummy smile. For a long moment she stared, the past pressing close like an old wound. Then she set it back down. Her eyes were dry. The first time Joanne's column appeared in the Sunday paper, she nearly laughed at how small it looked. Just two neat paragraphs on page B3, nestled between an ad for garden mulch and a notice about zoning permits. But there it was, her byline in bold, retired but not done. Her opening piece was simple, a meditation on respect, how easy it was to overlook the quiet work of older generations, and how powerful it was when they decided not to be silent. The words were plain, but the impact wasn't. Letters trickled in, then emails from strangers thanking her for saying what they couldn't. By the third week, the column doubled in length. She wrote about dignity in the face of family dismissal, about the danger of being written off as irrelevant. The editor called to say readership spiked each time her piece ran. Joanne didn't gloat. She just sat at her desk with her yellow legal pad, the same one she had used to log every hour of unpaid labor, and filled it with new words. This time not for a courtroom, but for anyone who needed them. One crisp afternoon, Joanne stepped into the little bakery at the corner of Main and Haywood. The smell of butter and sugar clung to the air, powdered sugar dusting the counter like fine snow. She ordered a single slice of chocolate cake and sat by the window. She ate slowly, savoring each forkful, as if time itself had finally slowed down for her. Halfway through, movement outside the glass caught her eye. Brad walked past on the sidewalk, his shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on the ground. He didn't see her, or maybe he did and chose not to. Either way, Joanne didn't lift her hand. She let him walk on, fading into the crowd, another man carrying his mistakes like stones in his pockets. "Excuse me." Joanne turned to see a young woman standing hesitantly near her table. Early 20s, maybe, hair pulled back in a messy bun, tote bag slung over her shoulder. Her voice trembled, but her eyes shone. You're Joanne Whitaker, right? From the paper?" Joanne nodded slowly. "I just wanted to say thank you," the woman said, her throat tightening around the words. "My mom's been going through something like what you wrote about. Reading your story gave her the courage to move out. She's starting fresh. You changed something for us." The girl's gratitude filled the air between them, fragile and profound. Joanne felt her chest tighten, not with pain this time, but with something sturdier, purpose. She reached out, resting a gentle hand over the girl's for a brief moment. "Tell her she's not alone," she said softly. After the woman left, Joanne finished the last bite of cake, its sweetness lingering on her tongue long after the plate was empty. She walked home under magnolia trees in full bloom, the blossoms thick and fragrant, petals drifting onto the sidewalk like snow. The late sun painted everything gold, and for once, Joanne didn't feel like she was walking through other people's shadows. She was walking her own path, each step steady, unhurried. Back at her townhouse, she settled into her sunroom chair, the window open to let in the soft evening air. The sky dimmed from lavender to indigo, and the first stars began to blink awake. She sat quietly, her hands folded, her breath even. The war was over, the noise had faded, and she was still standing. Her gaze drifted out the window, past the magnolias, past the dusk, her mind circling back to the moment it all began. The barbecue, the laughter, the insult that once pierced so deep. Her lips curved into a calm, final smile. "She humiliated me in front of neighbors. I humiliated her in front of the law.